The number of executions in Saudi Arabia has almost doubled under the kingdom's current leadership.
This video delves into some of the most severe punishments within Saudi Arabia's legal system or reported incidents.
The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where a prominent preacher is facing death sentence over using social media platforms to spread allegedly hostile news about the kingdom.
From unlawful detention to the suppression of dissidents, here are the 17 worst punishments in Saudi Arabia. Number 17. Unlawful detention and torture.
Having fun. They are laughing at her. They attach her hands and legs and they electrocute her.
In Saudi Arabia, unlawful detention and torture have been persistent issues. Numerous reports highlight cases where people are detained without due process or subjected to brutal treatment while in custody. Official claims to uphold principles against torture and mistreatment are contradicted by documented instances of detainees facing physical, psychological, and emotional abuse, often to extract confessions or as punishment. Unlawful detention bypasses standard arrest and trial procedures, leaving individuals without legal representation or contact with their families. This practice not only violates international norms, but also creates a climate of fear and suppression. Reports from human rights organizations detail grim accounts of physical violence, like beatings and lashings, and psychological torment, such as threats and forced disappearances. These actions violate fundamental human rights to dignity, safety, and freedom from cruel treatment. As Saudi Arabia aims to reform its image and modernize its society, these issues remain under international scrutiny. The global community urges the Saudi government to prevent unlawful detention and torture, ensuring justice, transparency, and human dignity in its judicial processes. As human rights and individual freedoms gain global emphasis, it is expected that Saudi Arabia will take steps to eradicate these practices, promoting a fair legal environment that respects human rights and the rule of law. Number 16. Criminalization of dissent and political activism.
A massive campaign to intimidate, arrest, jail, prosecute any Saudi citizen who dared to contradict official government policy.
In Saudi Arabia, criminalizing dissent and political activism stifles the development of a pluralistic and open society. Activists, journalists, and individuals who critique government policies or call for reforms often face severe consequences, including arrest, imprisonment, and harsher penalties. These measures define the limits of acceptable discourse, hindering open dialogue and critical thinking. The crackdown on political activism is evident in the numerous reports of human rights activists being detained for advocating societal changes, such as women's rights, civil liberties, and governance reforms. The government's tight control over freedom of speech and expression, enforced through stringent laws, has drawn international criticism for violating fundamental human rights. This criminalization extends beyond political activism to various societal aspects where individuals cannot openly discuss or critique religious doctrines, societal norms, and government policies. This restrictive environment fosters fear and self-censorship, stunting the growth of a vibrant civil society that could contribute to national development through diverse perspectives and innovative ideas. As the world watches Saudi Arabia's journey toward modernization and reform, there is a strong call for the nation to rethink its approach to dissent and political activism. By creating a space for diverse voices to be heard constructively, Saudi Arabia can evolve into a nation that truly embodies justice, equality, and democracy, aligning itself with the global movement toward human rights and freedoms for all. Number 15. Punishment for blasphemy.
45-year-old Mansour al-Marabi was on pilgrimage to Mecca when he was arrested a month ago for blasphemy. The family of a Victorian man sentenced to 500 lashes and 12 months in jail in Saudi Arabia say he may not survive his sentence.
Blasphemy is no laughing matter in Saudi Arabia. Speaking ill of Islamic beliefs, sacred texts, or religious figures can land you in serious trouble. Penalties range from long prison sentences and lashings to, in extreme cases, the death penalty. The international community isn't thrilled about this. Critics argue these laws stifle free speech and open discussion creating an atmosphere where dissent and diverse perspectives are silenced. The vague definition of blasphemy often leads to arbitrary arrests and convictions, adding to concerns about injustice. As Saudi Arabia pursues modernization with initiatives like Vision 2030, there's hope for a shift in approach, aligning with global perspectives on human rights and freedoms. Such a change could foster a more inclusive society where ideas can be exchanged constructively. Number 14. Punishment for treason.
Saudi Arabia, 196 executions at 200% rise.
Committing treason in Saudi Arabia can lead to severe consequences, including the death penalty. Treason covers a broad range of actions, from espionage and leaking state secrets to collaborating with foreign entities against national interests. Trials for treason are thorough, but the fairness of these trials is often questioned, with concerns about transparency and fair representation for the accused. Adopting a more balanced approach that respects both national security and justice could enhance Saudi Arabia's legal system. Ensuring fair trials and humane treatment can help align the country with global standards of justice and human rights, marking a significant step towards a more modern and inclusive nation. Number 13. Discriminatory punishments for women.
This is Izoham Kham when she was a little girl. She's now 29, and Human Rights Watch says she is the first Saudi woman to possibly face the death penalty for her human rights-related work.
Gender-based discrimination in Saudi Arabia extends into the legal realm, with women often facing harsher and more discriminatory punishments compared to men. These practices stem from patriarchal norms and conservative interpretations of Islamic law. Restrictions on women's mobility and harsher penalties for similar crimes are common. Critics point out a legal system biased against women, leaving them vulnerable to excessive punishments. The male guardianship system, although somewhat relaxed recently, has allowed for the legal subjugation of women, punishing them for asserting independence. Women also face significant hurdles in accessing legal representation, furthering their vulnerability in the judicial process. Corporal punishments have raised human rights concerns, with international groups highlighting the trauma they cause. Public punishments often reinforce gender hierarchies, controlling women's lives. As Saudi Arabia reforms and elevates women's rights, there's hope these discriminatory practices will be dismantled. Recent changes, like easing restrictions on women's mobility and public participation, suggest a shift towards a more equal society. It's hoped that the country will continue progressing towards a judicial system that ensures justice and equality, offering women the same rights and protections as men, marking a major step in the nation's journey towards inclusivity and modernity. Number 12. Punishment for homosexual acts. Homosexual acts in Saudi Arabia are met with harsh penalties. The country's laws, rooted in cultural and religious beliefs, impose fines, imprisonment, corporal punishment, and in extreme cases, even execution. These strict measures arise from Sharia law, which condemns such acts as severe moral violations. With Saudi Arabia undergoing significant changes in its social and legal systems, there is hope for a shift towards respecting the rights and dignity of all individuals. The ongoing reforms could lead to a re-evaluation of laws on homosexuality, aligning them with global standards of human rights and equality, and fostering a more inclusive society. Number 11. Criminalizing atheism. In Saudi Arabia, being an atheist can land you in serious trouble. The country's laws classify atheism under anti-terrorism regulations, viewing it as a threat to the Islamic identity of the nation. Those who openly declare their disbelief or criticize Islam face severe punishments, including imprisonment, fines, and in extreme cases, the death penalty. International human rights groups strongly oppose these laws, arguing they violate fundamental freedoms of thought and religion. Such measures suppress religious dissent and philosophical debate, creating a climate of fear for those with differing beliefs. As Saudi Arabia continues to modernize, there is hope for a more inclusive approach that respects a variety of beliefs and non-beliefs, fostering a society that values open dialogue and integration. Number 10. The Witch Hunt Chronicles. In Saudi Arabia, where ancient traditions and religious principles guide the law, the punishments for witchcraft and sorcery are a hot topic. The rules against these mystical misdeeds are quite vague. However, if you're accused of conjuring up some spells or dabbling in the dark arts, you might face extreme penalties, even death. This falls under Tazir, a system where judges have a lot of leeway in deciding your fate. Accusations can come from anything that seems suspicious: fortune-telling, crafting talismans, or practicing black magic. Often, these claims are fueled by gossip and personal grudges. The international community frequently criticizes these punishments, arguing they're not just a human rights issue, but also a bit outlandish since there's no scientific proof that witchcraft is real. Trials for these cases often get slammed for being unfair and lacking transparency. Reports say that accused individuals are often denied legal help and confessions might be coerced. With the world watching closely, Saudi Arabia faces the challenge of balancing its historical practices with a future that emphasizes justice, fairness, and humanity in its judicial system. Number 9. The high stakes of drug trafficking. Saudi Arabia takes a no-nonsense approach to drug trafficking, reflecting its zero-tolerance policy towards narcotics. Getting caught smuggling drugs can land you in serious trouble, with punishments as severe as life imprisonment or even the death penalty. This harsh stance underscores the kingdom's commitment to maintaining social order and protecting its citizens from the scourge of drug addiction and the violence that often comes with drug networks. Authorities in Saudi Arabia are vigilant, using intense surveillance and strict law enforcement to crack down on drug trafficking, both within the country and across its borders. As the nation continues its path of reform and modernization, there's growing hope for a shift in how these crimes are punished. People are advocating for a system that prioritizes rehabilitation and restorative justice over severe retribution. With a global shift towards reconsidering drug laws and exploring alternative solutions, the question remains: will Saudi Arabia adjust its policies to embrace a more balanced and humane approach to handling drug-related issues? Number 8. The harsh hand of justice. In Saudi Arabia, theft can lead to one of the most severe punishments: amputation. This penalty involves cutting off the convicted person's hand, and for repeat offenders, it can escalate to removing a hand and the opposite foot. This strict interpretation of Sharia law is meant to be a strong deterrent, visibly and permanently punishing the offender while warning others against stealing. However, this form of punishment raises significant concerns about the fairness and transparency of the judicial process. Reports of forced confessions and inadequate legal defense add to the controversy surrounding this brutal practice. With global condemnation and a push towards ending such severe penalties, Saudi Arabia has shown signs of gradual change. The nation is on a path of modernization and reform, trying to reconcile its traditions with a more humane approach to justice. The world watches closely, hoping for an end to these harsh practices and a move towards a more compassionate legal system. Time for the fancy topic. A shocking scene unfolded in Riyadh as several men were placed in a metal cage partially submerged in water. This unusual method, seemingly part of Saudi Arabia's punishment system, raised eyebrows and sparked debates worldwide. The men, wearing red uniforms, appeared anxious as they stood in the water, surrounded by the bars of the cage. This form of punishment seemed designed to invoke fear and humiliation rather than physical harm. Observers speculated about its effectiveness and the psychological impact on those involved. The incident highlighted the ongoing controversy surrounding Saudi Arabia's judicial practices. What do you think about this method of punishment? Do you believe it serves as a deterrent or crosses the line into cruelty? What do you think of this? Let us know in the comments with the hashtag #FancyTopic. Number 7. A grim spectacle. Public executions in Saudi Arabia are a stark example of the country's approach to justice. The death penalty is not only carried out but also displayed before a gathered crowd, serving as a grim warning against crimes such as murder and drug trafficking. These events often occur in well-known public squares, where the condemned, sometimes bound and blindfolded, face their final moments before an assembly of spectators. As Saudi Arabia progresses with its Vision 2030 plan, aimed at modernizing and diversifying its society, The practice of public executions remains a dark reminder of an older, harsher era. The international community continues to urge Saudi Arabia to abolish public executions, advocating for a stance more aligned with evolving human rights perspectives. While there has been a reduction in the number of these public events, suggesting a potential policy shift, the world remains hopeful for a complete end to this inhumane practice. Number 6. The price of apostasy. In Saudi Arabia, apostasy, or renouncing one's religious beliefs, is met with one of the most severe penalties: death. This harsh stance is seen as a way to maintain religious uniformity and stability in a society deeply rooted in Islamic traditions. The extreme penalty for apostasy has attracted significant criticism from international human rights organizations, which argue that it violates the fundamental right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. These criticisms have put considerable pressure on Saudi Arabia, highlighting the contrast between its policies and the global trend towards more tolerant and inclusive societies that respect individual freedoms. Number 5. Heads up on capital punishment. Capital punishment in Saudi Arabia, often performed by beheading, is a major point of controversy. Reserved for serious crimes like murder, rape, and drug trafficking, this method is carried out in public squares with a single sword strike. It's swift and considered less painful, but it's undeniably brutal and shocking to many worldwide. Critics argue that public beheadings foster a culture of violence and fear, serving more as a tool of oppression than justice. The public nature of these executions is seen as a way to assert state power, deterring potential criminals and controlling the populace. Recently, there's been a noticeable decline in public executions, suggesting a possible shift in policy. This change aligns with Saudi Arabia's broader efforts to reform its image and adopt a more modern, progressive identity on the global stage. The international community is closely watching, hopeful that this trend will lead to the abolition of such harsh punishments, bringing Saudi Arabia in line with global human rights standards. Number 4. The rocky road of adultery punishment. Stoning for adultery, known as rajam in Islamic law, is one of the oldest and most severe punishments, still purportedly enacted in places like Saudi Arabia. This penalty involves throwing stones at an individual until death, a method steeped in ancient beliefs about morality and chastity, often disproportionately targeting women. Although rare and infrequently documented in recent years, its existence in the legal framework sparks significant criticism. Human rights advocates strongly oppose stoning, labeling it as an extraordinarily cruel and inhumane punishment. It violates fundamental human rights, including the right to life and the prohibition against torture. As Saudi Arabia undertakes legal reforms and seeks to improve its international reputation, the presence of such a barbaric punishment is a significant obstacle. The global community keeps a vigilant eye on the nation's legal developments, urging the abolition of stoning and other cruel practices. How Saudi Arabia navigates the balance between traditional practices, religious beliefs, and international pressure will be crucial in shaping its future legal landscape. Number 3. Whipping up controversy with lashes. In Saudi Arabia, corporal punishment, particularly lashes, has been historically used for a variety of offenses, from moral violations to criminal activities. This method is rooted in a strict interpretation of Sharia law that governs the country's judiciary. Traditionally, lashes have been administered in public, turning the punishment into a spectacle intended to deter others. However, human rights organizations worldwide criticize this practice as cruel and inhuman. The physical impact can be severe, leaving lasting scars both physically and mentally. Critics argue that such punishment perpetuates a cycle of violence, endorsing physical harm as a legitimate form of retribution. The application of lashes can vary significantly, with the number and severity differing from case to case. This inconsistency adds to the brutality, allowing for arbitrary degrees of force and cruelty. Recently, Saudi Arabia has been reported to be reducing the use of this punishment. In 2020, a moratorium on flogging was introduced, suggesting a shift toward more humane forms of punishment, in line with global human rights standards. International organizations are closely monitoring these changes to assess the genuine intent and implementation of these reforms. This attention highlights the controversial practice of lashes and the significant, albeit slow, changes in its application in recent years. Number 2. Heads up on capital punishment. Capital punishment in Saudi Arabia, often performed by beheading, is a major point of controversy. Reserved for serious crimes like murder, rape, and drug trafficking, this method is carried out in public squares with a single sword strike. It's swift and considered less painful, but it's undeniably brutal and shocking to many worldwide. Critics argue that public beheadings foster a culture of violence and fear, serving more as a tool of oppression than justice. The public nature of these executions is seen as a way to assert state power, deterring potential criminals and controlling the populace. Recently, there's been a noticeable decline in public executions, suggesting a possible shift in policy. This change aligns with Saudi Arabia's broader efforts to reform its image and adopt a more modern, progressive identity on the global stage. The international community is closely watching, hopeful that this trend will lead to the abolition of such harsh punishments, bringing Saudi Arabia in line with global human rights standards. Number 1. The rocky road of adultery punishment. Stoning for adultery, known as rajam in Islamic law, is one of the oldest and most severe punishments, still purportedly enacted in places like Saudi Arabia. This penalty involves throwing stones at an individual until death, a method steeped in ancient beliefs about morality and chastity, often disproportionately targeting women. Although rare and infrequently documented in recent years, its existence in the legal framework sparks significant criticism. Human rights advocates strongly oppose stoning, labeling it as an extraordinarily cruel and inhumane punishment. It violates fundamental human rights, including the right to life and the prohibition against torture. As Saudi Arabia undertakes legal reforms and seeks to improve its international reputation, the presence of such a barbaric punishment is a significant obstacle. The global community keeps a vigilant eye on the nation's legal developments, urging the abolition of stoning and other cruel practices. How Saudi Arabia navigates the balance between traditional practices, religious beliefs, and international pressure will be crucial in shaping its future legal landscape. What's your opinion of the justice system of Saudi Arabia? Let us know in the comments below. See you next time.